I never thought shoveling snow for my neighbors would lead to a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It all started with a simple desire to be left alone and ended with police cars, lawyers, and the complete implosion of our neighborhood's governing body. For most of my life, I've operated on a simple principle: you work hard, you treat people fairly, and you mind your own business. I own a small landscaping and snow removal company, a business built on sweat and reliability. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and it's allowed me to build a decent life in our quiet little subdivision, Oakwood Creek. For the first 10 years I lived here, Oakwood Creek was exactly what you'd hope for. It was a peaceful collection of houses where people waved when you drove by, brought over baked goods when you moved in, and generally left each other to their own devices. We had a homeowners association, but it was mostly a formality. It existed on paper, collecting a couple $100 a year from each of us to keep the lights on at the front entrance and patch the odd pothole. The meetings were sparsely attended, usually just a few old-timers who enjoyed the coffee and donuts. It was benign, almost invisible, and that's how we all liked it. It was a community, not a corporation. Then, about 2 years before the storm that changed everything, Brenda moved in. Brenda was a woman who seemed to be powered by a perpetual motion machine of dissatisfaction. She was recently retired from a long career as an office manager, a role that had apparently convinced her she possessed a unique and indispensable talent for organizing the lives of others, whether they wanted it or not. She saw our quiet, loosely run neighborhood not as a peaceful enclave but as a chaotic mess in desperate need of her firm hand. Within 6 months, she had attended every HOA meeting, volunteered for every committee, and used a combination of relentless persistence and procedural maneuvering to get herself elected president of the board. The changes started small, like the slow creep of an invasive weed. First, it was the trash can edict. All receptacles had to be completely out of sight from the street no more than 2 hours after the garbage trucks had passed. An email was sent out, citing a previously non-existent subsection of a forgotten bylaw. Then came the Holiday Decoration Memorandum, a multi-page document outlining the precise dates for the installation and removal of any and all festive adornments. Christmas lights put up before the 1st of December were subject to a $25 fine. Mailboxes were next. An official notice declared that all mailboxes had to be a uniform shade of heritage black, with house numbers in a specific, pre-approved font. People grumbled. It was annoying, a solution in search of a problem, but it was the kind of petty stuff that felt easier to comply with than to fight. We were all busy with our own lives, and no one wanted to go to war over the color of their mailbox. We didn't realize we were conceding territory to a tyrant. We were just painting our mailboxes and hoping she'd find a new hobby. That winter, the sky fell. The weather forecasters called it a once-in-a-generation blizzard, and for once, they weren't exaggerating. Snow started falling on a Tuesday afternoon and didn't stop for 36 hours. When we finally woke up on Thursday morning, the world was silent and white. A solid 3 feet of heavy, wet snow blanketed everything, with drifts that rose halfway up our front doors. The city was completely paralyzed. The news said it could be days, maybe even a week, before municipal plows made it to residential side streets like ours. For most people, this was a massive problem. For me, it was just another day at the office. I had my commercial-grade plow on my Ford F-250 and a beast of a snowblower that could chew through ice and compacted snow like it was cotton candy. I cleared my own driveway first, a wide path of clean, black asphalt in a world of white. Then, I did what I always do. I started on my neighbor's driveways. I began with Mr. Henderson across the street. He was in his 80s and needed to get to a dialysis appointment the next day. Then I moved on to Sarah's house next door. She was a single mom with 2 young kids, and I knew there was no way she could dig herself out. It was just what you did. It was being a neighbor. I wasn't charging anyone a dime, I was just helping. I was halfway through clearing the long driveway of the Miller family when I saw her. Brenda. She was standing at the end of the driveway, right in the path of my truck, a small, stout figure bundled in a ridiculously expensive-looking ski jacket. Her arms were crossed, and her face was pinched into a mask of pure indignation. I put the truck in park, killed the engine, and rolled down the window, the sudden silence amplifying the cold. "Morning, Brenda," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Bit of a mess, who?" She didn't return the greeting. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. I blinked. "I'm clearing a driveway." Helping out, she took a step closer, her boots crunching in the snow. "You are operating commercial-grade heavy machinery within the residential bounds of this community for non-contracted purposes. That is a direct violation of the Oakwood Creek HOA bylaws." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "You can't be serious, Brenda. People are trapped in their homes. Mr. Henderson has a medical appointment." Her expression didn't soften. It was like arguing with a brick wall, if a brick wall could look smug. "Mr. Henderson is free to contact one of the HOA's pre-approved and insured snow removal vendors," she stated, as if this were a reasonable suggestion in the middle of a state of emergency. "Your actions constitute a breach of Rule 7, Section C, Subsection 4." She recited it from memory, a zealot quoting her scripture. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it left me speechless for a moment. We were in the middle of a natural disaster, and she was quoting bylaws at me. "Brenda, this is my truck, and these are my neighbors," I said, my patience wearing thin. "I'm not running a business here. I'm helping people who are stuck." She shook her head, a tiny, self-righteous motion. "The rules are in place to protect the community's aesthetic and to limit liability. Your unsanctioned activities are a problem." Then came the threat, delivered with a chilling certainty. "I am officially informing you that you will be fined $500 for every driveway you clear from this point forward. I will be documenting your violations personally." She held up her phone as if to prove her point. I just looked at her, then at the wall of snow still trapping my neighbors, and I made a decision. I rolled up my window, started my truck, and lowered the plow. I wasn't going to be stopped by a petty tyrant in a puffy coat. The war had begun. I finished the miller's driveway, then moved on to the next house, and the next. I could see Brenda standing on her own perfectly shoveled porch, phone in hand, dutifully documenting my violations. A part of me found it comical, but a larger part was filled with a cold, simmering anger. I cleared every single driveway on our street and the two adjoining ones, a total of about 15 homes. I made sure Mr. Henderson had a clear path for the medical transport van, and I even did a wide pass down the center of the street to give everyone at least a fighting chance of getting out if they needed to. By the time I was done, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted, but the street looked like a functioning neighborhood again. The first letter arrived 2 days later. It was a crisp, white envelope with the Oakwood Creek HOA logo printed in the corner. Inside was an official-looking violation notice, detailing my breach of Rule 7, Sec 4. At the bottom was the penalty, a fine of $500. I remember laughing as I tossed it onto my kitchen counter. It felt like Monopoly money, a ridiculous piece of paper from a make-believe government. The second letter arrived the next day. And the third, the day after that. She was sending one for each driveway. By the end of the week, I had a stack of violation notices totaling $7,500. The certified letter came the following Monday. This one felt different. It was heavier, more official. It was a formal demand for payment of the accumulated fines, stating that failure to pay within 30 days would result in further legal action, up to and including the placement of a lien against my property. That's when the laughter stopped. A lien. That was real. That could affect my credit, my ability to get loans for my business, even my ownership of my home. This had escalated from a ridiculous neighborhood squabble to a serious financial threat. Brenda wasn't just posturing, she was weaponizing the HOA's power against me. The snow began to melt, but the conflict's chill remained. The neighborhood was now divided. Some neighbors, the ones I had helped, would give me a thumbs up or a quiet thank you when they saw me. But they were cowed. They didn't want to get on Brenda's bad side. They had seen what she was doing to me, and they didn't want to be her next target. The community services were genuinely impacted. Because I had only done a single pass down the middle of the road, the mail carrier's truck still couldn't get to the mailboxes. She had to park at the end of the street and walk the route, trudging through deep snow, all because Brenda's precious pre-approved vendors, who were nowhere to be found, hadn't cleared the roads properly. Mr. Henderson's visiting nurse had to park 3 blocks away and walk in, delaying his care. When someone raised this issue in an email chain, Brenda's response was swift and devoid of empathy. Compliance with community bylaws is paramount. Residents should have made appropriate arrangements. I was getting angrier by the day, but I felt trapped. My neighbor, George, saw the state I was in. George was a retired union negotiator in his late 60s, a man who had spent 40 years in smoke-filled rooms, hammering out contracts and staring down corporate executives. He had a calm demeanor that hid a spine of pure steel. He came over one evening, holding 2 bottles of beer. "She's a bully, Mark," he said as we sat at my kitchen table, the stack of violation letters sitting between us like a coiled snake. "And there's only one way to deal with a bully. You don't just punch back. You dismantle their entire power structure." He told me that Brenda's type thrived on perceived authority and the apathy of others. They pushed until they met real resistance, and then they often folded. "But this Lynn threat," George said, tapping the certified letter with his finger, "this is a real punch. You need to get ahead of this. You need a lawyer." I hated the idea. It felt like a massive overreaction, bringing in lawyers over snowplowing. But George was right. Brenda had made it a legal fight, and I was an amateur in that arena. He gave me the name of a man named Davies, a lawyer he knew who specialized in property law and, as George put it, untying knots tied by petty tyrants. My meeting with Mr. Davies took place in a small, book-lined office that smelled of old paper and quiet confidence. He was a man in his 50s with graying temples and a methodical way of speaking. I laid out the whole story, from Brenda's rise to power to the stack of fines and the threat of a lien. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his face unreadable. When I was done, he steepled his fingers and looked at me over his glasses. "Homeowners associations have a surprising amount of power," he began, his voice calm and even. "They can fine you, they can place liens, and in some extreme cases, they can even foreclose on your home. It's not to be taken lightly." My stomach tightened. "So she can actually do this?" I asked. "Potentially," Davies said. "However, that power is not absolute. It must be wielded reasonably and in accordance with the association's own governing documents and state law." Her interpretation of this commercial equipment rule seems, on the face of it, to be an overreach, especially given the emergency circumstances. But fighting it piece by piece is a fool's errand. She'll just invent a new violation. He leaned forward slightly. "You said it yourself. She's a tyrant. You don't win by arguing about the particulars of her decrees. You win by challenging her right to rule." He then laid out the strategy. The first step was to formally dispute the fines and the lien, which he would handle. The second, and more important step, was to go on the offensive. "Petty tyrants are almost always sloppy," he said, echoing George's sentiment. "They get so focused on enforcing the rules on others that they neglect to follow them themselves. Especially when it comes to money." He advised me to use my rights as a homeowner to request a full accounting of the HOA's finances. I was entitled to see the budget, the bank statements, the contracts, the meeting minutes, everything. "Look for irregularities," he instructed. "Look for payments to companies you don't recognize. Look for bids that weren't solicited. Look for anything that smells funny. Somewhere in that paperwork, Brenda has made a mistake. Our job is to find it." I left his office feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. The game had changed. I was no longer just defending myself, I was launching an investigation. Getting the documents was the first battle. My initial email request to the HOA board for the financial records was met with a condescending reply from Brenda herself. She stated that the records were not available for general inspection and that my request was improperly formatted. It was a classic bureaucratic stonewall. I forwarded her email to Mr. Davies, who drafted a formal legal request on his letterhead, citing the specific state statutes that required the HOA to provide financial transparency to its members. He sent it via certified mail. The tone of the next reply was markedly different. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived at my door containing a stack of photocopied bank statements, a budget spreadsheet, and a collection of invoices. While I waited for the legal gears to turn, George and I began a quieter investigation. We started talking to our neighbors, not just about the snowstorm, but about their own run-ins with Brenda. The stories poured out. Fines for leaving a garden hose called on the lawn instead of on a reel. A warning for a child's bicycle left in a driveway overnight. A violation for having a window air conditioning unit that was deemed aesthetically displeasing. Each story was a small piece of a larger puzzle, a pattern of harassment and control. This was when Kevin came into the picture. Kevin lived 3 doors down and was a software engineer, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. George and I caught him coming in from work one evening, and we asked if he'd had any issues with Brenda. His face darkened. "You have no idea," he said. He invited us inside and told us his story. A few months prior, during the summer, he had received a violation notice claiming his lawn was overgrown. The notice, signed by Brenda, stated that his grass exceeded the 4-inch maximum height mandated by the bylaws and fined him $100. "The thing is," Kevin said, a wry smile playing on his lips, "I had just mowed it 2 days before. I knew it was impossible." What Brenda didn't know was that Kevin was an avid drone hobbyist. "I fly my quadcopter almost every morning to check out the weather conditions," he explained. "It's got a high-resolution camera. And I always save the footage." He turned to his computer and pulled up a video file. It was dated the exact morning he had received the violation notice. The drone footage was crystal clear, a bird's-eye view of his entire property. He flew the virtual camera down to lawn level, where a small ruler he had placed by his front walk was clearly visible. The time-stamped video showed his grass measuring a neat, uniform 3 inches. He had sent the footage to Brenda, politely pointing out her error. Her response was to dismiss the evidence as inadmissible and threaten him with further fines for unauthorized aerial surveillance. Kevin, not wanting a fight, had reluctantly paid the fine just to make her go away. But he had saved the video. It was a perfect, undeniable piece of evidence that Brenda wasn't just a stickler for the rules, she was a liar who fabricated violations to punish people she didn't like. As compelling as Kevin's story was, the real bombshell was waiting for me in the stack of financial documents on my dining room table. I spent hours poring over the spreadsheets and statements, my eyes bleary from the tiny print. It was mostly mundane stuff: payments for insurance, water for the front entrance sprinklers, electricity. But then I found it. A recurring monthly payment, always for several $1,000s, made out to a company called Community Maintenance Solutions, LLC. The description on the payment line was always vague: common area maintenance, groundskeeping services, or seasonal cleanup. My heart started beating a little faster. I knew all the contractors the HOA used. I knew the lawn care guys, the electricians, the plumbers. I had never heard of Community Maintenance Solutions. The most glaring entry was a massive payment from January, right after the big snowstorm. It was for $10,000, and the memo line read, "Emergency snow removal services." This was impossible. I was the one with the official, board-approved contract for snow removal in the common areas. I was the one who had actually plowed the entrance and the small cul-de-sac by the little parkette. And I was still waiting to be paid for that work, an invoice I had submitted weeks ago. Here was a $10,000 payment to a ghost company for work that was never done. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened my laptop. I went to the state's online business registry and typed Community Maintenance Solutions, LLC, into the search bar. The result popped up instantly. The company was active and in good standing. My eye scanned down the page to the section for registered agent. The name listed was not Brenda's current married name. It was her maiden name, a detail I had gleaned from a casual conversation with a neighbor who had known her years ago. The address listed for the business was a post office box in a neighboring town. She had been paying herself. She had invented a company, given it a generic name, and was funneling thousands of dollars of our HOA dues directly into her own pocket. The snow removal payment was the most audacious part. She had fined me for doing the work for free, while simultaneously paying her own shell company $10,000 for a job it never did. It was fraud. It was embezzlement. It was everything. I finally had her. The discovery shifted everything. I was no longer on the defensive, trying to fend off illegitimate fines. I was now on the offensive, armed with irrefutable proof of criminal activity. I immediately called Mr. Davies and sent him copies of the bank statements and the business registration. His response was swift. "This is it," he said, his voice holding a note of professional excitement. "This is the leverage. We don't just get the lien removed. We get her removed." He laid out the next phase of the plan. The HOA's annual members' meeting was scheduled in 3 weeks. It was the perfect venue. It was a public forum, mandated by the bylaws, where every member had a right to be heard. "We don't tip our hand," Davies advised. "We let her walk into that meeting feeling completely in control. Then we present the evidence to the entire community at once. We give her no time to spin a story or hide the records." In the weeks leading up to the meeting, George, Kevin, and I became a secret committee. We worked discreetly, calling and visiting neighbors one by one. We didn't reveal the embezzlement at first. We simply said that we had uncovered some serious mismanagement and that it was critical for everyone to attend the upcoming meeting. We talked about Kevin's lawn and the drone footage, a tangible example of Brenda's dishonesty. We talked about the snowstorm and the absurdity of my fines. We built a coalition of the frustrated. The annual meeting, which usually drew a dozen people at most, was about to become the biggest event of the year in Oakwood Creek. We were preparing for a revolution, and our weapon of choice was a PowerPoint presentation. The night of the annual meeting, the small community clubhouse was packed. I had never seen it so full. Every chair was taken, and people were standing along the back and side walls. There was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and resentment. Brenda sat at the head table with the other 2 board members, a quiet man named Tom and a woman named Carol who seemed to be perpetually intimidated by Brenda. Brenda, for her part, looked smug. She clearly interpreted the large turnout as a testament to her effective leadership, a sign that her efforts to improve the community were finally being recognized. She opened the meeting with a long, self-congratulatory speech. She talked about property values, community standards, and the importance of vigorous rules enforcement. She made several thinly veiled references to unauthorized commercial activity and the successful resolution of recent compliance issues. From my seat in the 3rd row, I could feel the anger in the room simmering. She was gloating about fining me for helping my neighbors. When she finally finished her monologue and moved to the agenda item for new business, I stood up. "I have a presentation for the community," I said, my voice steady. Brenda frowned. "You are not on the agenda, Mark, according to Article 3, Section 2 of the bylaws," a calm voice boomed from the back of the room. "Any member in good standing has the right to address the board during new business." It was George, holding a copy of the HOA's governing documents. The crowd murmured its assent. Brenda, caught off guard by the organized resistance, had no choice but to relent. "Fine," she snapped. "But keep it brief." Kevin was already at the side of the room, connecting my laptop to a projector he had brought. The first slide lit up the screen at the front of the room. It was a picture of Kevin's violation notice, the one for his overgrown lawn. Next to it, I played the drone video. I narrated the story calmly, pointing out the date on the notice and the timestamp on the video, showing the ruler in the grass measuring a perfect 3 inches. You could hear whispers and gasps spreading through the audience. People were seeing, for the first time, concrete proof that Brenda was not just strict, but dishonest. Brenda's face was beginning to lose its smug confidence. "This is irrelevant," she said, her voice rising. "This matter was resolved, was it?" I asked the room. Kevin paid a $100 fine for a violation that never happened. "Does that sound resolved to you?" I didn't wait for an answer. I clicked to the next slide. It was a scan of the HOA's bank statement, with the first payment to Community Maintenance Solutions, LLC, highlighted in yellow. "I'd like to talk about the budget," I said. specifically about our contract vendors. I walked the audience through it, slide by slide. The recurring payments. The vague invoices. Then, the $10,000 payment for emergency snow removal. I showed them my own unpaid invoice for the same work. The whispers in the room grew louder. People were starting to put the pieces together. Tom and Carol, the other board members, were looking at Brenda with expressions of confusion and dawning horror. And then, for the grand finale, I projected the screenshot from the state's business registry. The name of the company, and next to it, the name of the registered agent, Brenda's maiden name. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was staring at the screen, then at Brenda, whose face had turned a ghastly shade of pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. It was all there, undeniable and damning. The lies, the fraud, the embezzlement. It's a misunderstanding, she finally stammered, her voice a weak croak. It's just a clerical error, a different company with a similar name, but her denial was feeble, transparent. The evidence on the screen was absolute. The silence broke. People started shouting questions from all corners of the room. How much did you take? Is that where our dues have been going? Mr. Henderson's daughter stood up, her voice trembling with rage, and spoke about how Brenda had tried to stop me from clearing the snow that allowed her father to get to his life-saving medical treatment. Sarah, the single mom, stood up and talked about being trapped with her kids. The authority that Brenda had so carefully constructed, built on a foundation of fear and petty rules, crumbled into dust in less than 5 minutes. She tried to bang her gavel, to call for order, to adjourn the meeting, but no one was listening anymore. George stood up and formally made a motion for a vote of no confidence in the entire board. It was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was nearly unanimous. As the community was ousting its corrupt leader, someone at the back of the room was already on the phone. The flashing blue and red lights of a police cruiser pulling up outside the clubhouse were the final, surreal punctuation mark on Brenda's reign of terror. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of official activity. The police officers who arrived at the chaotic meeting took initial statements from me, George, Kevin, and several other residents. They collected the documents I had presented and assured us that a detective would be in touch. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation within a week. With the evidence so clearly laid out, the bank statements, the fake invoices, the state business registration, it wasn't a complex case. Brenda's attempt to portray it as a bookkeeping misunderstanding fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. Faced with an ironclad case against her, Brenda's lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of theft by deception and embezzlement. The judge was not amused by the details of the case, particularly the fact that she had stolen from her own neighbors while simultaneously harassing them over trivial matters. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay over $40,000 in restitution back to the HOA, and hit with a substantial fine. She was also, of course, permanently barred from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity again. Her public humiliation was complete. The day after her sentencing, a for sale sign went up on her lawn. My own legal troubles vanished like mist in the morning sun. Mr. Davies filed a motion with the court, and the judge overseeing Brenda's case issued an order to immediately and permanently remove the illegal lien from my property. All the fines she had levied against me were declared null and void. The newly formed interim HOA board, led by a reluctant but highly effective George, held an emergency meeting. Their first official act was to vote unanimously to pay my outstanding snow removal invoice. Their second act was to pay Mr. Davies's legal bill in full, along with a handwritten card thanking me for what I had done. My reputation in the neighborhood was more than restored. I was treated like some kind of local hero, which was an uncomfortable but gratifying feeling. With Brenda gone and her cronies having resigned in disgrace, the community had to rebuild its own government. I was approached by dozens of people, all asking me to run for president of the new HOA. I appreciated the sentiment, but I politely and firmly declined. I'm the guy who plows the snow and cuts the grass, I told them. I'm a doer, not a meeting sitter. My skills were with engines and spreadsheets for my own business, not with Robert's rules of order. George, thankfully, agreed to stay on as interim president to guide the transition. A new board was elected, composed of reasonable, level-headed people who understood that an HOA's purpose was to maintain the community, not to police the lives of its residents. Their first major project was a complete overhaul of the bylaws. They went through the rulebook page by page, slashing Brenda's litany of petty restrictions. The trash can edict, the mailbox color mandate, the holiday decoration schedule, all of it was wiped from the books. A new era of common sense and neighborly respect began. The neighborhood could finally breathe again. A year passed. Oakwood Creek settled back into its quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of apathy that had allowed Brenda to seize power, it was the comfortable peace of a community that had been tested and had come out stronger. People were more connected. We had our first ever neighborhood block party that summer, and the turnout was huge. People who had been strangers for years were now grilling burgers together and laughing. The shared experience of overthrowing a petty tyrant had forged a genuine bond between us. Property values, which had reportedly dipped slightly during Brenda's reign due to her reputation spreading among local real estate agents, began to climb again. The neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses anymore, it was a community in the truest sense of the word. I did see Brenda one last time. It was about 6 months after she had moved out. I was in the produce section of the grocery store in the next town over, trying to decide between two heads of lettuce. I heard a quiet, hesitant voice say my name. I turned, and it was her. She looked diminished. The fiery, self-righteous certainty was gone from her eyes. She was just a middle-aged woman in a drab coat, looking tired and lost. She wouldn't meet my gaze directly, instead focusing on a point somewhere over my shoulder. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry," she mumbled, the words barely audible over the store's piped-in music. "For everything." I stood there for a long moment, looking at her. The anger and frustration I had felt for so long were completely gone. I didn't feel triumph or a desire for revenge. All I felt was a profound sense of pity. What a waste. All that energy, all that intelligence, twisted into a desperate need to control everything and everyone around her, and it had led her to this. Ruin, shame, and a mumbled apology in a grocery store aisle. I gave a short, simple nod. "I appreciate that," I said. It was all that needed to be said. She scurried away with her shopping cart, and I went back to choosing my letters. Forgiving her wasn't really the point. The point was that it was over, and I had moved on. Looking back on the whole insane affair, I realize it was never really about the snow. It was about the abuse of power, even on the smallest of scales. It was a lesson in how easily a community can be eroded by the relentless efforts of one person with a lust for control and how quickly that control can evaporate when confronted with simple, undeniable truth. It showed me the importance of not just being a quiet, hard-working neighbor, but of being an engaged one. Standing up to a bully is never easy, but when you do it not just for yourself, but for the people around you, for the elderly man who needs his medicine, for the single mom who needs a clear path, you find a strength you didn't know you had. In the end, tyrants like Brenda almost always engineer their own downfall. Their own greed and arrogance become the very tools of their undoing. The next winter came, and with it, another heavy snow. It began falling in the late afternoon, thick, silent flakes that promised a deep blanket by morning. I was in my kitchen, finishing dinner, and I watched the world turn white again. But this time, there was no sense of dread, no looming conflict. There was only a quiet anticipation. I finished my coffee, pulled on my heavy boots and warm coat, and walked out to my truck. The engine turned over with a familiar, reassuring rumble. As I backed out of my driveway and lowered the big steel plow, I saw lights coming on in my neighbors' houses. I saw curtains being pulled back. I saw a few people give me away from their front windows. I wasn't a violator anymore. I was just Mark, the neighbor with the plow, doing what needed to be done. And as I started down the street, carving a clean, dark path through the fresh snow, the work felt right. It was a simple act of service, a reaffirmation of the simple, decent idea that we are all in this together, and that the best rule of all is the one that tells us to just help each other out.